Dear listeners, welcome back. A new case begins with the sound of a gunshot in the quiet of the night. Does one person's death benefit another? Let's jump into the story. Chapter 28: The Regent's Park Murder. By this time, Miss Polly Burton had become quite accustomed to her extraordinary vis-a-vis in the corner. He was always there when she arrived in the selfsame corner, dressed in one of his remarkable check tweed suits. He seldom said good morning, and invariably when she appeared he began to fidget with increased nervousness, with some tattered and knotty piece of string. "Were you ever interested in the Regent's Park murder?" he asked her one day. Polly replied that she had forgotten most of the particulars connected with that curious murder, but that she fully remembered the stir and flutter it had caused in a certain section of London society. "The racing and gambling set particularly, you mean," he said. All the persons implicated in the murder, directly or indirectly, were of the type commonly called society men, or men about town, whilst the Harewood Club in Hanover Square, round which centred all the scandal in connection with the murder, was one of the smartest clubs in London. Probably the doings of the Harewood Club, which was essentially a gambling club, would forever have remained officially absent from the knowledge of the police authorities but for the murder in the Regent's Park and the revelations which came to light in connection with it. I dare say you know the quiet square which lies between Portland Place and the Regent's Park and is called Park Crescent at its south end, and subsequently Park Square east and west. The Marylebone Road, with all its heavy traffic, cuts straight across the large square and its pretty gardens, but the latter are connected together by a tunnel under the road. And of course you must remember that the new tube station in the south portion of the square had not yet been planned. February 6, 1907 was a very foggy night. Nevertheless, Mr. Aaron Cohen, of 30 Park Square West, at 2 o'clock in the morning, having finally pocketed the heavy winnings which he had just swept off the green table of the Harewood Club, started to walk home alone. An hour later, most of the inhabitants of Park Square West were aroused from their peaceful slumbers by the sounds of a violent altercation in the road. A man's angry voice was heard shouting violently for a minute or two, and was followed immediately by frantic screams of police and murder. Then there was the double sharp report of firearms, and nothing more. The fog was very dense, and, as you no doubt have experienced yourself, it is very difficult to locate sound in a fog. Nevertheless, not more than a minute or two had elapsed before Constable F-18, the point policeman at the corner of Marylebone Road, arrived on the scene, and having first of all whistled for any of his comrades on the beat, began to grope his way about in the fog, more confused than effectually assisted by contradictory directions from the inhabitants of the houses close by, who were nearly falling out of the upper windows as they shouted out to the constable, "By the railings, policeman! Higher up the road! No lower down! It was on this side of the pavement, I am sure. No, the other." At last it was another policeman, F-22, who, turning into Park Square West from the north side, almost stumbled upon the body of a man lying on the pavement with his head against the railings of the square. By this time, quite a little crowd of people from the different houses in the road had come down, curious to know what had actually happened. The policeman turned the strong light of his bullseye lantern on the unfortunate man's face. "It looks as if he had been strangled, don't it?" he murmured to his comrade. And he pointed to the swollen tongue, the eyes half out of their sockets, bloodshot and congested, the purple, almost black hue of the face. At this point, one of the spectators, more callous to horrors, peered curiously into the dead man's face. He uttered an exclamation of astonishment. "Why, surely, it's Mr. Cohen from number 30. The mention of a name familiar down the length of the street had caused 2 or 3 other men to come forward and to look more closely into the horribly distorted mask of the murdered man. "Our next-door neighbor, undoubtedly," asserted Mr. Ellison, a young barrister, residing at number 31. "What in the world was he doing this foggy night all alone, and on foot?" asked somebody else. "He usually came home very late. I fancy he belonged to some gambling club in town. I dare say he couldn't get a cab to bring him out here. Mind you, I don't know much about him. We only knew him to nod to. Poor beggar. It looks almost like an old-fashioned case of garroting. Anyway, the blackguardly murderer, whoever he was, wanted to make sure he had killed his man. added Constable F-18, as he picked up an object from the pavement. "Here's the revolver with 2 cartridges missing. You gentlemen heard the report just now. He don't seem to have hit him, though. The poor bloke was strangled, no doubt. And tried to shoot at his assailant, obviously," asserted the young barrister with authority. "If he succeeded in hitting the brute, there might be a chance of tracing the way he went. But not in the fog." Soon, however, the appearance of the inspector, detective, and medical officer, who had quickly been informed of the tragedy, put an end to further discussion. The bell at number 30 was rung, and the servants, all 4 of them women, were asked to look at the body. Amidst tears of horror and screams of fright, they all recognized in the murdered man their master, Mr. Aaron Cohen. He was therefore conveyed to his own room pending the coroner's inquest. The police had a pretty difficult task, you will admit. There were so very few indications to go by, and at first literally no clue. The inquest revealed practically nothing. Very little was known in the neighborhood about Mr. Aaron Cohen and his affairs. His female servants did not even know the name or whereabouts of the various clubs he frequented. He had an office in Throgmorton Street and went to business every day. He dined at home and sometimes had friends to dinner. When he was alone, he invariably went to the club, where he stayed until the small hours of the morning. The night of the murder, he had gone out at about 9 o'clock. That was the last his servants had seen of him. With regard to the revolver, all 4 servants swore positively that they had never seen it before, and that, unless Mr. Cohen had bought it that very day, it did not belong to their master. Beyond that, no trace whatever of the murderer had been found, but on the morning after the crime, a couple of keys linked together by a short metal chain were found close to a gate at the opposite end of the square, that which immediately faced Portland Place. These were proved to be, firstly, Mr. Cohen's latchkey, and secondly, his gate key of the square. It was therefore presumed that the murderer, having accomplished his fell design and ransacked his victim's pockets, had found the keys and made good his escape by slipping into the square, cutting under the tunnel, and out again by the further gate. He then took the precaution not to carry the keys with him any further, but threw them away and disappeared in the fog. The jury returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown, and the police were put on their mettle to discover the unknown and daring murderer. The result of their investigations, conducted with marvelous skill by Mr. William Fisher, led, about a week after the crime, to the sensational arrest of one of London's smartest young bucks. The case Mr. Fisher had got up against the accused briefly amounted to this. On the night of February 6th, soon after midnight, play began to run very high at the Harewood Club in Hanover Square. Mr. Aaron Cohen held the bank at roulette against some 20 or 30 of his friends, mostly young fellows with no wits and plenty of money. The bank was winning heavily, and it appears that this was the 3rd consecutive night on which Mr. Aaron Cohen had gone home richer by several hundreds than he had been at the start of play. Young John Ashley, who is the son of a very worthy county gentleman who is MFH somewhere in the Midlands, was losing heavily, and in his case also it appears that it was the 3rd consecutive night that fortune had turned her face against him. "Remember," continued the man in the corner, "that when I tell you all these details and facts, I am giving you the combined evidence of several witnesses, which it took many days to collect and to classify. It appears that young Mr. Ashley, though very popular in society, was generally believed to be in what is vulgarly termed low water, up to his eyes in debt and mortally afraid of his dad, whose younger son he was, and who had on one occasion threatened to ship him off to Australia with a £5 note in his pocket if he made any further extravagant calls upon his paternal indulgence. It was also evident to all John Ashley's many companions that the worthy MFH held the purse strings in a very tight grip. The young man, bitten with the desire to cut a smart figure in the circles in which he moved, had often recourse to the varying fortunes which now and again smiled upon him across the green tables in the Harewood Club. Be that as it may, the general consensus of opinion at the club was that young Ashley had changed his last pony before he sat down to a turn of roulette with Aaron Cohen on that particular night of February 6th. It appears that all his friends, conspicuous among whom was Mr. Walter Hatherell, tried their very best to dissuade him from pitting his luck against that of Cohen, who had been having a most unprecedented run of good fortune. But young Ashley, heated with wine, exasperated at his own bad luck, would listen to no one. He tossed one 5-pound note after another on the board. He borrowed from those who would lend, then played on parole for a while. Finally, at 1:30 in the morning, after a run of 19 on the red, the young man found himself without a penny in his pockets and owing a gambling debt. A debt of honor of £1,500 to Mr. Aaron Cohen. Now we must render this much maligned gentleman that justice which was persistently denied to him by press and public alike. It was positively asserted by all those present that Mr. Cohen himself repeatedly tried to induce young Mr. Ashley to give up playing. He himself was in a delicate position in the matter, as he was the winner, and once or twice the taunt had risen to the young man's lips, accusing the holder of the Bank of the Wish to retire on a competence before the break in his luck. Mr. Aaron Cohen, smoking the best of Havanas, had finally shrugged his shoulders and said, "As you please." But at 1:30 he had had enough of the player who always lost and never paid, never could pay, so Mr. Cohen probably believed. He therefore at that hour refused to accept Mr. John Ashley's promissory stakes any longer. A very few heated words ensued, quickly checked by the management, who are ever on the alert to avoid the least suspicion of scandal. In the meanwhile, Mr. Hatherell, with great good sense, persuaded young Ashley to leave the club and all its temptations and go home, if possible to bed. The friendship of the two young men, which was very well known in society, consisted chiefly, it appears, in Walter Hatherell being the willing companion and helpmeet of John Ashley in his mad and extravagant pranks. But tonight the latter, apparently tardily sobered by his terrible and heavy losses, allowed himself to be led away by his friend from the scene of his disasters. It was then about 20 minutes to 2. "Here the situation becomes interesting," continued the man in the corner in his nervous way. "No wonder that the police interrogated at least a dozen witnesses before they were quite satisfied that every statement was conclusively proved." Walter Hatherell, after about 10 minutes' absence, that is to say at 10 minutes to 2, returned to the clubroom. In reply to several inquiries, he said that he had parted with his friend at the corner of New Bond Street, since he seemed anxious to be alone, and that Ashley said he would take a turn down Piccadilly before going home. He thought a walk would do him good. At 2 o'clock or thereabouts, Mr. Aaron Cohen, satisfied with his evening's work, gave up his position at the bank and, pocketing his heavy winnings, started on his homeward walk, while Mr. Walter Hatherell left the club half an hour later. At 3 o'clock precisely the cries of murder and the report of firearms were heard in Park Square West, and Mr. Aaron Cohen was found strangled outside the garden railings. Who killed Mr. Cohen? Mr. John Ashley? Or someone coveting Mr. Cohen's money? Chapter 29: The Motive. Now at first sight the murder in the Regent's Park appeared both to police and public as one of those silly, clumsy crimes, obviously the work of a novice, and absolutely purposeless, seeing that it could but inevitably lead its perpetrators, without any difficulty, to the gallows. You see, a motive had been established. Seek him whom the crime benefits, say our French confrères. But there was something more than that. Constable James Funnell, on his beat, turned from Portland Place into Park Crescent a few minutes after he had heard the clock at Holy Trinity Church, Marylebone, strike 2:30. The fog at that moment was perhaps not quite so dense as it was later on in the morning, and the policeman saw two gentlemen in overcoats and top hats leaning arm in arm against the railings of the square, close to the gate. He could not, of course, distinguish their faces because of the fog, but he heard one of them saying to the other, "It is but a question of time, Mr. Cohen. I know my father will pay the money for me, and you will lose nothing by waiting." To this the other apparently made no reply, and the constable passed on. When he returned to the same spot, after having walked over his beat, the two gentlemen had gone, but later on it was near this very gate that the two keys referred to at the inquest had been found. "Another interesting fact," added the man in the corner, with one of those sarcastic smiles of his which Polly could not quite explain, was the finding of the revolver upon the scene of the crime. That revolver, shown to Mr. Ashley's valet, was sworn to by him as being the property of his master. All these facts made, of course, a very remarkable, so far quite unbroken, chain of circumstantial evidence against Mr. John Ashley. No wonder, therefore, that the police, thoroughly satisfied with Mr. Fisher's work and their own, applied for a warrant against the young man, and arrested him in his rooms in Clarges Street exactly a week after the committal of the crime. As a matter of fact, experience has invariably taught me that when a murderer seems particularly foolish and clumsy, and proofs against him seem particularly damning, that is the time when the police should be most guarded against pitfalls. Now, in this case, if John Ashley had indeed committed the murder in Regent's Park in the manner suggested by the police, he would have been a criminal in more senses than one, for idiocy of that kind is to my mind worse than many crimes. The prosecution brought its witnesses up in triumphal array one after another. There were the members of the Harewood Club, who had seen the prisoner's excited condition after his heavy gambling losses to Mr. Aaron Cohen. There was Mr. Hatherell, who, in spite of his friendship for Ashley, was bound to admit that he had parted from him at the corner of Bond Street at 20 minutes to 2 and had not seen him again till his return home at 5 a.m. Then came the evidence of Arthur Chips, John Ashley's valet, proved of a very sensational character. He deposed that on the night in question, his master came home at about 10 minutes to 2. Chips had then not yet gone to bed. 5 minutes later, Mr. Ashley went out again, telling the valet not to sit up for him. Chips could not say at what time either of the young gentlemen had come home. That short visit home, presumably to fetch the revolver, was thought to be very important, and Mr. John Ashley's friends felt that his case was practically hopeless. The valet's evidence and that of James Funnell, the constable, who had overheard the conversation near the park railings, were certainly the two most damning proofs against the accused. I assure you I was having a rare old time that day. There were two faces in court to watch, which was the greatest treat I had had for many a day. One of these was Mr. John Ashley's. Here's his photo, short, dark, dapper, a little racy in style, but otherwise he looks a son of a well-to-do farmer. He was very quiet and placid in court, and addressed a few words now and again to his solicitor. He listened gravely, and with an occasional shrug of the shoulders, to the recital of the crime, such as the police had reconstructed it, before an excited and horrified audience. Mr. John Ashley, driven to madness and frenzy by terrible financial difficulties, had first of all gone home in search of a weapon, then waylaid Mr. Aaron Cohen somewhere on that gentleman's way home. The young man had begged for delay. Mr. Cohen perhaps was obdurate, but Ashley followed him with his importunities almost to his door. There, seeing his creditor determined at last to cut short the painful interview, he had seized the unfortunate man at an unguarded moment from behind and strangled him. Then, fearing that his dastardly work was not fully accomplished, he had shot twice at the already dead body, missing it both times from sheer nervous excitement. The murderer then must have emptied his victim's pockets, and, finding the key of the garden, thought that it would be a safe way of evading capture by cutting across the squares under the tunnel and so through the more distant gate which faced Portland Place. The loss of the revolver was one of those unforeseen accidents which a retributive providence places in the path of the miscreant, delivering him by his own act of folly into the hands of human justice. Mr. John Ashley, however, did not appear the least bit impressed by the recital of his crime. He had not engaged the services of one of the most eminent lawyers, expert at extracting contradictions from witnesses by skillful cross-examinations. Oh dear me, no. He had been contented with those of a dull, prosy, very second-rate limb of the law who, as he called his witnesses, was completely innocent of any desire to create a sensation. He rose quietly from his seat and, amidst breathless silence, called the first of 3 witnesses on behalf of his client. He called 3, but he could have produced 12 gentlemen, members of the Ashton Club in Great Portland Street, all of whom swore that at 3 o'clock on the morning of February 6th, that is to say, at the very moment when the cries of murder roused the inhabitants of Park Square West, and the crime was being committed, Mr. John Ashley was sitting quietly in the club rooms of the Ashton playing bridge with the 3 witnesses. He had come in a few minutes before 3, as the hall porter of the club testified, and stayed for about an hour and a half. I need not tell you that this undoubted, this fully proved, alibi was a positive bombshell in the stronghold of the prosecution. The most accomplished criminal could not possibly be in 2 places at once, and though the Ashton Club transgresses in many ways against the gambling laws of our very moral country, yet its members belong to the best, most unimpeachable classes of society. Mr. Ashley had been seen and spoken to at the very moment of the crime by at least a dozen gentlemen whose testimony was absolutely above suspicion. Mr. John Ashley's conduct throughout this astonishing phase of the inquiry remained perfectly calm and correct. It was no doubt the consciousness of being able to prove his innocence with such absolute conclusion that had steadied his nerves throughout the proceedings. His answers to the magistrate were clear and simple, even on the ticklish subject of the revolver. "I left the club, sir," he explained, fully determined to speak with Mr. Cohen alone in order to ask him for a delay in the settlement of my debt to him. "You will understand that I should not care to do this in the presence of other gentlemen. I went home for a minute or two, not in order to fetch a revolver, as the police assert, for I always carry a revolver about with me in foggy weather, but in order to see if a very important business letter had come for me in my absence. Then I went out again and met Mr. Aaron Cohen not far from the Harewood Club. I walked the greater part of the way with him, and our conversation was of the most amicable character. We parted at the top of Portland Place, near the gate of the square, where the policeman saw us. Mr. Cohen then had the intention of cutting across the square, as being a shorter way to his own house. I thought the square looked dark and dangerous in the fog, especially as Mr. Cohen was carrying a large sum of money. We had a short discussion on the subject, and finally I persuaded him to take my revolver, as I was going home only through very frequented streets, and moreover carried nothing that was worth stealing. After a little demur, Mr. Cohen accepted the loan of my revolver, and that is how it came to be found on the actual scene of the crime. Finally, I parted from Mr. Cohen a very few minutes after I had heard the church clock striking 3:15. I was at the Oxford Street end of Great Portland Street at 5 minutes to 3, and it takes at least 10 minutes to walk from where I was to the Ashton Club. This explanation was all the more credible, mind you, because the question of the revolver had never been very satisfactorily explained by the prosecution. A man who has effectually strangled his victim would not discharge 2 shots of his revolver for, apparently, no other purpose than that of rousing the attention of the nearest passerby. It was far more likely that it was Mr. Cohen who shot, perhaps wildly into the air when suddenly attacked from behind. Mr. Ashley's explanation, therefore, was not only plausible, it was the only possible one. You will understand, therefore, how it was that, after nearly half an hour's examination, the magistrate, the police, and the public were alike pleased to proclaim that the accused left the court without a stain upon his character. The story comes to a temporary pause. Do you agree with the court's conclusion, or do you have a different perspective? Feel free to leave your comments, and we'll see you tomorrow.